Hello, everyone. Well, I must say this, I was in and out, but it was really a fabulous day for everything that I've heard. And, I know we're going to have a great session. So I know we have Professor Bob Garratt. I don't really think he needs an introduction. I mean, he has been on so many of these sessions, full of knowledge, just oozes out is all I'm going to say, really. But we know him famously for his book, his bestseller, The Fish Rot from the Head. That just tells he's going to tell us all the things we should be doing right. So that is it. And then we have two very excellent panelists, Justine Lucas. I mean, we all have their CVs, but just to say a little bit, Justine is an executive director of Rihanna's Clara Lionel Foundation, which focuses on climate resilience and climate justice, and both in the Caribbean and the United States. And Justine is also currently a team member on the Council of Foreign Relations. The other member we have is Misha. Well, oh gosh, I know Misha very well. In fact, when she was the CEO for the Institute of Charter Council Caribbean, I actually hired her. So I know she's good stuff. But then she went on to other things, and she's now the, besides being a management, public relations, communication specialist, and she's very good at that. I can attest to that for sure. She really holds currently the position of Executive Director of the Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So I welcome everyone. But let's go to the star, Professor Bob Garratt. Over to you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm flattered. Right. Let me negotiate with Clara. Clara, I'll junk some of the formal stuff I was going to do, and just try and pick up about 5 points from what's gone on during the day, if I may, around the Great Wealth Transfer issues. But I'm still slightly recovering from Dan's input. So you would have to bear with me on that. But it was Dan's input in a way that really gave a totally different perspective. And I was reminded of a quote from E.O. Wilson, the bioscientist, biosociologist, who said, "We enter the 21st century with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." It's worth thinking about those three things. And then he finishes by saying, "And we do ourselves great harm and others." So when I'm thinking about Dan, and I love the presentation, wildly enthusiastic, I was also thinking, look, there's a series of contradictions here. Could we actually make the sort of changes he was mentioning in 9 years and then in 19 years? On the one hand, I'm thinking, no, that is just not possible. On the other hand, I'm thinking 18 months ago, when COVID really came in and lockdowns occurred around the world, I suddenly had to stop flying British Airways club class. And within 3 days, I was on Zoom, and then I've spent the last nearly 2 years on Zoom and Team and all the other versions. So it is possible we can change some of the technology quickly, but that doesn't mean to change the basic human emotions. And those Stone Age emotions still intrigue me. Peter, when he started, and others throughout, and these presentations today, have all talked about relationships, have all talked about trust, have all talked about cooperation in one way or other. And only on Sunday, we had the COP26 ending, which I found very interesting indeed, because although it didn't achieve everything it wanted, and things are being moved on to Paris next year, the key word I think that I noticed, which was different from previous COPs, was cooperation and help. And that was a change of public, global, if you like, global emotion, to say we're really in trouble. We have to begin to seriously start helping each other. And the more I thought about that, I logged a quick note here of a change in world consciousness. And then when I was thinking about the sessions we ran with CCGI earlier in the year, particularly when we had Mervyn King talking with us, there was a great deal that Mervyn and I were agreed on, particularly around the issue of the board of directors having to not just be the business processor of the total business, but given the pressures from the public, the changing pressures from the public, particularly with the jargon word or jargon phrase ESG at the moment, given that, it's about the board being both the business processor, but also the business conscience. And it's this notion of being the conscience, which I think began to come through quite strongly in COP. And I thought that was very interesting in terms of governance, because I think that began to quite clearly set the beginnings of a global contextual change in terms of the way we think about the governance, not just of our countries, but particularly given our interest in terms of our organizations. So I was brooding away about that. And we saw, for example, it's now almost impossible to admit you're in the oil industry or the coal industry or the gas industry without feeling a bad conscience on it. Now, in some ways, that's actually fairly stupid because we're going to have to live with them for at least 30 to 50 more years. But that sort of awareness is beginning to percolate through. And I was then brooding on, what does that mean in terms of sitting in a boardroom, the way we now think about the three fundamental capitals we deploy in our work? The financial capital, about which we've heard a lot today, the environmental capital, about which we're beginning to hear a lot more today, and the social capital, which we're just beginning to tune into and realize the notion of business being seen much more as part of an ecosystem than a separate, completely independent, completely autonomous body in its own right, existing in space, but really having no particular linkage into the rest of the world, except through its financial connections. And that whole thing got me worrying away about people inputs, and especially again in relation to the way we develop our directors, whose role is to give direction to the total organization on the one hand, and on the other hand, keep it under prudent control. And they've got to balance continuously, and it is a dynamic balance, those two roles. So what I've been writing, and will publish in the new year, is a new book that looks at 4 levels of board maturity. And in relation to today, I had a real problem then with Dan's wonderful statements about the future, because my own work suggests that 95% of people who become directors have not a clue what they're meant to be doing. There's no real development for them. There's certainly no real training, especially in Dan's terms. And in the 4 levels of board maturity, I call these accidental directors. They sort of signed a piece of paper to say they're now a director, but there's no way of following through with that. There's also no commitment from them to become a professional director, to understand what the job is. So that puzzles me. The second level of these folk is to begin to realize, oh my God, this is serious, because it is a legal commitment I have made without understanding what I've done. And so they do a little bit of minimal commitment, and they become what I call grudging directors. They're grudgingly compliant directors. So as I say, they do the minimal possible just to get away with the box ticking, but they don't enjoy it, and they're normally quite miserable in their job. The breakthrough moment comes at level 3, when they begin to realize that they have to learn how to become a proper functioning director. And so that's the learning board, and that goes back to the fish rots from the head book about how we begin to do that. And then the fourth level is the one I'm pursuing at the moment, is the professionalization of directors. And I believe the public now around the world is so fed up with the lack of competence of most people who become directors that they are now beginning to ask for minimal levels of competence specified, and there are various specifications coming through in different parts of the world, but beginning to specify precisely what is needed to even be minimally competent as a professional director. And that in a way is where I am at the moment. I'm intrigued, particularly then, if we go to Peter's framing of today in terms of the great wealth transfer, because many of the people I've spoken with, particularly in family companies, not so many have I spoken with in family offices, but in family companies and in non-listed companies around the world, across all 6 continents now, find that they are pretty much accidental directors. And the generational shift, which Peter is talking about, is that the next generation are beginning to say, as we take over often significant assets from either the founding parents or from the existing parental system, or the founders of the company, we are going to have to pay a lot more attention to the ESG type pressures. And we're going to have to be much clearer in our consciences about what we can and can't do in giving future direction to our company. And that's the bit that absolutely intrigues me. And I think at the moment I would pause there and invite Misha and, excuse me, I'm joking, Justine to respond, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Garratt. And let me start by, are you able to hear me clearly?
Ooh.
Yes.
Angela?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. I'd like to just start by commending CCGI for this, its continued thought leadership, and for hosting this conference, looking at the great wealth transfer. Now, interestingly, Angela and colleagues, I find that this discussion on the ultra high net worth individuals and the investment opportunities for the Caribbean is really taking place within the context of against a backdrop of the economic realities facing Barbados and other countries in the Caribbean that have been so significantly impacted by the COVID pandemic that certainly the future of these economies have to be looking at what are the alternatives to maybe to tourism, for example, that we can, in terms of investment opportunities, to be able to buoy or ensure the sustainability of our economies. But of course, the Barbados, like others, are looking at other alternative investment opportunities like fintech, construction industry, and certainly ICT and digitalization that we spoke about today. But we're looking at these alternate investment opportunities within the context of other countries that have greater competitive advantage. Now, alongside that, for the economic realities is, of course, the fact that the pandemic has also brought front and center, and this is where I want to focus on, the need for companies to look at increasingly ESG issues and ensure a greater integration of ESG into the organization's core business management and strategy. And so Professor Garratt is looking at what does that mean? We're looking at the G then in ESG. And certainly there's always been a greater focus on environmental and the social, but I really have to concur with Professor Garratt as we look at how the need for companies to shift from the primary focus of shareholder value to looking more at enterprise value creation, looking at how we measure profits and the value of the organization activities, that we also have to look at the governance structure. So this discussion kind of brings us to look at the governance factors in decision making. And when we're looking at the governance, we're looking at, of course, the rights and responsibilities of within a corporation of the different stakeholders, the board members, the managers, the shareholders, and the stakeholders, the kind of oversight that we have for executives. These are all the makeup of the board, and these are all are now occupying front and center issues for when we look at corporate governance structures and how these are going to, the dynamics, how are they changing because of the COVID pandemic? And I like what you said, Professor Garratt, it's not just about only looking at the professionalism of directors to be able to move companies in the direction that we need, but we also need to be looking at things like the agility of the boards, how the boards are going to be functioning in the new COVID pandemic, you know. So of course, S&P Global Research, for example, looks at what are the governance factors, how we rank governance, because if we are not looking at governance factors in how we manage companies, then we're going to have poor governance practices and poorly managed companies continuing to result in corporate scandals like the recent Facebook misuse of data and the Volkswagen's emission test scandal. So I'm interested to hear, and I'm going to pause here just to allow Justine to also bring her own perspective on what we are looking at in terms of ESG when we and specifically governance and the future of boards.
Thanks.
Thank you, Misha. I'm happy to jump in and agree with so many of your points. Obviously, given our founders' home country is Barbados, I share so much of your sentiments and know that there are a lot of other factors that play, not only a pandemic, but an economic crisis. And I think there's a lot to take into consideration with all of this. But I really also liked Professor Garratt's point about consciousness. You know, our founder is incredibly innovative. So at Clara Lionel Foundation, we're always thinking about how are we thinking about the future that we want. And, you know, what we learned while listening and learning in the Caribbean was that climate resilience was important. You know, there's a reality of natural disasters that's going to continue to occur. And, you know, I think a lot of communities are really concerned about, will their children have a school to go to? You know, will their health clinic still exist? You know, I think this is a reality that is true in the Caribbean. And so, you know, in thinking about what this next generation is looking at, what they're interested in, they're thinking about futures, which has been a lot of the conversation today. And so, you know, I think I was trying to figure out how, you know, Clara Lionel Foundation, we're a nonprofit organization. So we're really engaged in philanthropy. But so I was trying to figure out, you know, working with Kamala and Peter, how our work fits into this ecosystem that you're discussing today. And I think, you know, what we need and what investors are looking for, you know, is more, you know, longer term systemic change. You know, I think people are thinking big picture. And for us, in terms of the work we do, we work across the Caribbean, really piloting projects that demonstrate what climate resilience looks like. And for us, that means hardening infrastructure, equipping it with renewable energy, looking at just all the elements of a holistic model to help health clinics, schools, essential critical facilities withstand natural disasters. A lot of our work happens to be in Barbados, but yeah, I think, you know, I think that's an important part of the equation is we're coming into a space where there is a greater consciousness of climate and its effects. We're coming into a greater, a space where there's greater consciousness of just, social impact aspects. And a point that I've heard made today is that folks aren't looking at investing as a siloed aspect of their environment. They're looking at investing alongside impact, investing alongside their philanthropy, and they want an ecosystem that fits together. So I think that's a point I would add to the mix of, that systemic approach that taking away the silos of how we've worked when it comes to anything related to the finance industry, I think is the future.
Angela.
Excellent. I think, all the points you all have made are fantastic. I think at the end of the day, I'll give an example sometimes where I think institutions can be very insular. I had this meeting where, and it was the Bankers Association, so I was talking obviously in relation to the banks. And I just said, what's going on with COVID? I think the banks have to look differently. It's not about making profits. I was dearly told by a CEO, well, Angela, if you're talking that I have 40 billion, whatever, in assets, and my profit is only 700 million, the rate of return is not there. I said, well, I'm hearing you, but I do not think in this time, that's what we need to be looking at. Because I see, you have to look at what COVID is really doing to the economy and people out of jobs, right? What are you really doing? And saying, okay, I know, yes, I'm not saying profit is a bad word, but if you do not help the society that needs it, you're not going to have customers. So it's balancing that act, I think, which is important, because profit is not a bad word, but I don't think in today's economy, when people are talking about, oh, my profit this year is so much larger than last year, I'm not impressed. I'm sorry, I'm not impressed. It does not impress me. I would be much more impressed, say, yes, this is what I've done, but I have done this in terms of the ESG or whatever. To me, that I could be proud of. But don't tell me you just made more double the. It's not something that really, and I'm in finance, but it certainly does not hurt me. So maybe I may have the wrong view. That's why I don't run a bank. So, but that's what I think. I think at the end of the day is the ethical decisions we make in the long term is important.
Remember, in the common law countries, it is quite clear that the legal purpose of a board of directors is to ensure the long-term existence of the company. And one of the big issues of COVID at the moment is if you take short-term perspectives, you're running into all sorts of trouble. And one of the good things, I think, which wasn't mentioned very much today, but the work Peter's doing, and particularly the work Mike Maynelli has been doing in London on the notion not just of impact bonds, but of performance bonds. And performance bonds related to E and S, and coming back to Misha's point, G, which is a much more difficult, it's relatively easy to get a performance bond specification, relatively easy, on environmental impact. It's relatively easy to get a performance bond on social or community impact. It's trickier, at least at the moment, to get a performance bond on governance. But that's where I think the notion of professionalism has got to come in and be treated very seriously.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on something Angela said, and Angela certainly really going back to Peter's point of the new generation that's driving and how different their the value and the value that drives them are. And I think it falls within the whole context of even now, companies have to begin to see, what John Elkington speaks to, and he's a corporate responsibility and sustainability development expert, and he speaks to the fact that we are now in an age where it's a new focus, and the new focus is it's on the triple bottom line. It's no longer about just a focus on profits. And that's, I really want to say that because I want to underscore the point that Angela made. The triple bottom line is looking at people, planet, and profits. And companies, Professor Garratt, have to now begin to think it's not, and I know that the school of thought is very divided, but it's not just about driving company profit at the expense of your human resources and at the expense of your profit. And certainly the climate conference is bringing that as well as and re-emphasizing that companies, directors, in helping to drive strategy in any organization have to begin to change the thinking, change the approach to strategy for a company, the strategic direction of a company, and ensure that all of these elements are brought into the whole decision-making process for a company. And that's why for me, Angela, like you, I was very impressed with some of those companies here in Barbados, for example, who opted understanding their own responsibility and during a COVID environment that was impacting the economies, chose to not decide, not to cut staff, but rather took a more measured approach to say, let us leave that as our last resort. And this is kind of like, for me, was a refreshing approach to this whole profit-driven focus that companies have. And at no time am I advocating that companies do not, and directors do not have a responsibility to first the shareholders and to the long-term sustainability of a company, but it cannot be done at the expense of or people or human resources. That's the people input that you spoke to earlier, Professor Garratt, and of course to the environment, which is now the big topic of debate that is happening.
There is a delicious irony in this, that the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profits, was developed over 20 years ago by Shell Oil, and Shell are now the devil incarnate.
I think to Misha's point, though, I think Shell Oil probably developed that as part of a corporate social responsibility play, which I would say is an antiquated term. And
So
and
would
to your
I.
point, yeah, I think to your point, Misha, I think, you know, I would say not only this next generation, but I think we're right currently at a tipping point where people are looking at companies' behavior across a broad spectrum. It's not just because they have one little program that is their impact area. You know, it has to be in how they govern. It has to be in how they treat their staff. It has to be in the impact they're having with the products they're putting out into the world, how they're thinking about the environment. That's all important now.
It has to be an integrated approach.
Absolutely.
If I may just come into the discussion a little bit too, and to share that, you know, linking the point Angela made with her example and what Professor Garratt has said, and so bringing in the context of all the discussions we have shared today, really what we are seeing is that as much as profitability is important, a lot of today's presentation spoke about things like reputations, trust, you know, and collaboration in how we do things. And I totally take Angela's point that organizations can have, and some did, say that we will not be posting profits looking at an increase from the year previous. We do know that we have a responsibility to ensure that there's that financial viability of the organization, but we would also take this time to ensure that our employees are well looked after, and that those who needed to have salaries, even though they would be home because they had tested positive and needed to be under restrictions and all those things, there really were some amazing examples of that as well. And to tie directly to what Professor Garratt said, so the legal duty of directors is the long-term sustainability of the organizations. So when we think long-term sustainability, what do we mean? And it really is making those kinds of decisions which wins over the trust and loyalty of your employee, as well as the trust and loyalty of customers who will want to support the organization in the long term. So that the board of directors and senior management, in reflecting that understanding and making those kinds of decisions, really can help in that focus and carrying out their legal duty by that focus of the long-term sustainability, by doing the things that demonstrate care and concern for employees and customers as well. So and these are really important things that that we are discussing. And if I could bring Peter into the discussion now, and if you guys don't mind, we will share your session as part of our wrap up as well. I really think today helped underscore that as much as the world is going to be moving at warp speed, if we follow Dan, according to Professor Garratt as well, you know, that is really turning the whole world on its axis. But throughout still, there was the need for us to understand the role of governance, and the role of governance, bringing it right back to what we are saying. How do we develop trust? How do we ensure that there is collaboration rather than competition? How can we get the kind of win-win solutions that help all of us to be able to grow together? So Peter, one of the things that I'm absolutely convinced about, we did discuss that this is likely to be what will be the outcome of today, is I'm absolutely convinced we need to invite all of our speakers and all of our panelists back and actually focus each day on a different segment that's going to not let us run out of time, as I unfortunately let happen today, but really allowed us to engage with participants as well and build out each of these areas in terms of what it means for the region and how we can build competitiveness with governance at its core.
Yes, indeed. Well, as I touched upon in my discussion, I really see this as an ecosystem and a great level of interconnectedness. And from this perspective, it's been a great pleasure to see all of the moving parts in a separate manner and try to put it together. And that's why I emphasized early on, this is not just a great wealth transfer in terms of finance and economics. It's about culture. It's spiritual to some people. It's technological. It's lifestyle. And we are shifting inevitably towards that world in the longer term of the global, virtual global citizen. But in the context in which we were looking to frame it, and that's obviously why I brought Dan in, he was showing you what could be an ultimate big picture of just how automated things are at sort of the highest level and the epitome of interconnectedness. The issue is, and again, I see this in family offices, but also this is where I see we're going into the future. There are still these substantial silos that are completely, that there's over-specialization in certain areas. And I'll give an example. I had a discussion with another family out of America, and they want to keep coming to Europe, and it's for a different reason to why I love America, because they think that the Europeans, in their opinion, have a more broader, rounded view as far as being investment officers, and they understand a greater amount of things. I love America because, of course, I find obviously the best people in private equity, the best people in hedge funds with that sort of knowledge are there. But again, they've got that specific Connecticut, they've got that New York, or that other, or if you go to Silicon Valley in California, they've got that ecosystem and the big domestic market. But again, because it's so big, they often miss the forest from the trees and don't understand the cultural and global and other international perspectives of the world around them, even though they are obviously, in some cases, the leaders of the industry and iconic figures. That's something that I felt we needed to basically interconnect with one another to understand how to create that sustainable future. The other point, of course, what I was looking at is, of course, when you look at just the family offices, the private investors, they all invest obviously into social impact investments and make philanthropic contributions. But what is the long-term model of that? And I presented and discussed briefly how, imagine if we have a philanthropic foundation with 100 million, 50% of those funds were invested in impact and say, or 60%, and that other 40 to 50 was delegated to philanthropy. The returns from the impact investments and dividends can actually help fund the continuation of the philanthropic, rather than eventually depleting those funds or requiring more donors. And again, there's an American model with 501c3 that is very attractive. So you can have some foundations where they're constantly getting that drip feed of donors. But in other models internationally, it's not necessarily that, it's the passion of that person. And once that's depleted and that visionary is gone, sometimes those foundations that are doing so much good can move. Where the governance part comes in is in the proper integration. And what I love about Bob's methodology and line of thinking is, and again, I've never had this with a governance book, I just couldn't stop the rot down, which normally has been reserved for regulators, lawyers, accountants, and really being seen as that sort of necessary evil they have to check the box on. But it actually was a very dynamic and empowering methodology of looking at governance. And so ultimately, with, say, the families and the philanthropists that believe in the sector and are seeding it and have a long-term vision, the issue is how do we create the institutional flow of this becoming a major alternative investment category of impact investment. And the key to that is obviously convincing those institutions with that E plus ESG, with that economic returns, where you're capturing that portion of the market where they're focused significantly on economic returns. You're now not just focusing on someone who wants to make a difference, although many people do, but now you can rationalize the argument. You're making the same or similar returns, same or similar risk profile, and most people surveyed said they would go with the impact investment. So as a result of it, I think we could, depending upon how the flow goes, be looking at impact investment, in the coming generation as a big legitimate alternative investment category, like hedge fund, like private equity, etc. And remember, in their parts, they're smaller, but in totality, family offices and ultra high net worth individuals comprise more capital and assets under management than most or all of these other categories. And so where the governance fits in and governments obviously are creating policies and advantages, the institutions have the big capital, and the family offices and the impassioned initial impact investors and philanthropists are seeding it. But we need to know how to best interface and help these early stage family investors grow, that it's not just an extension of their passion, but also in some cases, it's actually economically viable. That removes the excuse, of course, of, well, okay, we can't really make the same profits. We've got shareholders to satisfy. If all things being equal, then that argument's there. And I also love the area, and that's of course what I was trying to convey about the social conscience of the next generation, and that heartbeat is strong, it's alive, it's well, but they don't yet have the full control of those funds. But come when the Gen Xers and particularly the millennials, who are even more centered in this way, I believe we're going to look at a major, major revolution. And how to enable and integrate all of this, I think, is really what would the embodiment and the heart and soul of why I felt this was this great generational wealth transfer. Its time has come, but to be an integrated ecosystem, not just a flow of money and how advisors can capture a piece of this for their practice. That's short-term thinking. It's not going to create a sustainable future.
Totally understand. And I think when we add to the mix the excitement of what's likely to happen with what Dan Mates has said, and how the world is going to change, that's very interesting. But I think also when we look at Professor Manelli's presentation, and you realize that a lot of these countries and how they have developed their competitiveness it was also very deliberate and intentional that they would have chosen to make the kinds of decisions that would enable them to build their quality of life and hence, their level of competitiveness. We are just 3:42 now. We're heading to 4 o'clock, so we would look to end the session soon. I see we do have a question in the chat. Oh, Camille has her hand up. So Camille, we'll just take your question quickly, and then I'm going to ask Justine to give us her wrap up in terms of her thoughts, what she has heard today. And similarly, Misha, a quick wrap up as well. Angela sits on the board of some very important organizations, and those that are also aligned to multinationals. How then are we making any kinds of changes to ensure that we all take in heed of these kinds of changes? Then we'll have a few minutes wrap up from Professor Garratt, and finally Peter, and then we take it from there, right? So let's just hear Camille, forgive me. Camille, your question very quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, I'm curious, when you talk about investing funds for philanthropy, how different is that from the traditional trust fund that would be set up for whatever business, etc.? They would set up trust funds. Isn't that something similar, or
it's usually segregated? It's usually segregated with, and again, when you look at a family constitution, Camille, there will be usually segmented and a clearly defined criteria of what the objectives are, categories of investments, but then of course, where there's that philanthropic and impact component, that is obviously very unique to the nuances of that family in particular. And of course, as mentioned, the next gens are very passionate about that and are now having a greater influence over it. Of course, culturally, when you look at this, when I was living in India, Asia and Africa, because they felt so integrated with their cultures, there was this feeling of just stepping up. So you actually found some of the wealthier individuals from that culture would step up because they were very reliant upon the communities. But getting back to it, it can be a segregated component of that trust fund or a separately structured one, but it all really stems off from that family governance, family constitution, etc. Generally, when it's a properly managed and structured family or family office. If, of course, it's newer money and it's usually come from an operator and they're not as systemized, and that's where you've got a great opportunity for the Caribbean and Asia, is they've got something like 85% is one of the statistics of the ultra high net worth and family office community are still founders of that original business that created the liquidity event. So they are still very much the entrepreneurial patriarch is there, but you've now got those next gens and millennials that have that global mindset, number one. So again, that gives you an opportunity to align interests with these next gens, particularly from Asia and elsewhere, of course. And also as well with the virtual global citizen movement that I think is going to be enabled even more. You can do some things directly, but also in a remote basis, and understand how you're serving with the picks and shovels to enable a lot of these initiatives for that segment of the market. I hope that answers that question somewhat.
Yes, it does.
Right. Thanks, Peter. And actually, I'm remembering that Antonia had her hand up earlier for one of the sessions, but had not had the opportunity to ask it. So, Antonia, if you just wanted to share your thoughts with us now, that would be fine. So we take that into consideration as we wrap up today.
Thanks, Kamla. I was listening to the presentation this morning and the one this afternoon about the AI. And one of the things that stood out for me during COVID was this conversation around digital transformation. And my mind goes back to when we started this journey 30 odd years ago. We thought digitization and automation would remove paper. And what it did was created more paper. And I'm listening to cryptocurrency, and the basis for acquiring cryptocurrency is paper and the tangible money. And there is, that nice pyramid we talked about, that as much as we are talking about self-actualization and transformation, at the end of the day in COVID, it has put people right back down to that bottom tier of psychological safety. And we keep gravitating back to those tangible things that we can hold. And so the question that keeps coming up to me when we look at digital transformation, particularly in Trinidad, and I'm connecting it again to the transfer of wealth in Trinidad, which comes through capital investment in physical infrastructure. And every time I walk into one of the government complexes and I look at the design of it that is structured for people to be present, and now we're having this conversation about transformation, which will no longer have that need for that physical footprint. My question is, do the experts here think the trajectory is going to be the digital transformation as a form of displacement of the physical, or is it going to be a conversion of the physical, meaning we will see more of a gradual pushing back of the physical from the front end, you know, the people coming in to do the service, to more of the back end of people working the processes behind the scenes? Or are we going to have a leap where we just abandon all these physical edifices and just go into these smaller footprints, straight into no contact, you know, electronic, digital kinds of interaction?
Angela, do you want to consider that? Because I mean, your companies have a lot of young people who are working, and as Danmate said, you know, there are these games now where you have literally hundreds of thousands of young people who are connected without being physically present as well. What are your thoughts to?
I will tell you, I think we're never going to go back to the physical, right? As we know it. Yes, I do have a lot of young people, and from the day it was declared as a pandemic, my entire office was virtual because we were starting to look at a policy work from home. I literally just had 2 people who weren't internet ready as yet. So what we simply did is we hotspot them, and they were gone. But what I've found is you have to engage your staff, because you never know what is happening at their homes. You know, mental illness is a big thing. You really do not know. So you have to keep in touch. So one of the things I said to my managers, I hope you're talking to your staff, I said, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. Very often when I pick up the bloody phone is what's going on. I said, well, I need to say, how you're going, you know, you're gonna be that much more conscious. But what we've done, we do a lot of staff engagement, a lot of it. I mean, we just had Aegis Fest. We did it in a way that we ensured we could only have 10 people at a time in the office. So everybody were in teams. They had Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. We were in different teams. And to come in, so there were a lot of competition going on, but we took 10 people in the morning for 2 hours, 10 people in the evening. And we did it over like so many Fridays. So we captured you, and apparently everybody had a lot of fun. And really it was a smart way of getting stay interviews, trying to figure out how they felt. It's through the games. I mean, you know, young people are the best. You just give it to them and they will get it done. But I do think a lot has to do with the culture of an organization and how you feed that culture. I tell them they're all going to be leaders. So I just want to make sure they're the best leaders they have out there. And you to me, delegating to young people, they take it and they run with it. That's why I tell people, all I do is I mentor, they do everything I do. But it is really that, and I think transparency is a very, very, very big thing. It didn't mean to say when this came on that we weren't affected. We didn't know how things were going to do. Yes, so there was some cutback in salary, but we were transparent and showing them everything. And of course, everybody eventually went straight back up, and actually we're doing pretty good. I'm not going to complain, because they were able to adapt to the virtual thing. I mean, if somebody really want an in-person meeting, I will come up, but it's very rare. You know, we have the Zoom, the Teams, the everything. So I think it's changing. And yes, I think people are going to need to look at how they engage their people so that they don't feel, but there's still that human element. You know, people still want to sort of see people. You just need to see how you do that. But I think this is not going to change. It's just going to be continue.
Yes, thank you, Angela. I think I agree with Angela. You know, young people demonstrated that they have a great sense of comfort in the virtual environment. They're very happy and can easily connect, you know, online, and they're going to be the workforce that we're dealing with now. So there will also, just as Angela said too, there will be a need for us to have physical meetings from time to time, but it would no longer be the norm. We'd have to have strategies for having these kinds of get-togethers. But I think the last 2 years has demonstrated that for us too. I mean, I feel like I know Professor Garratt. I feel that we have almost sat down and had dinner already, yet I've never met him, you know. I look forward to the day that we would, you know, that he'd be able to come to the Caribbean here and we'd be able to have at least one physical session where we'd be able to have some sort of celebration of all that we've been able to achieve. But the reality is, in this virtual world, we've been able to connect very closely across continents with different people all over and been able to do tremendous work. So, Antonia, it's never going back to the physical world. You know, that's just going to support part of what we do. So as we wrap up now, I would like to ask Justine for just some of her thoughts, because I think she is also very connected with what this young generation think and feel and what their expectations are of us as we set what that governance structure is and how do we build trust and confidentiality. What's the kind of communication that we should be expecting as well. And I'm happy to see that Christy has put a survey in on the chat feature. I'll just like to ask all of our participants, please just give us some feedback on that. In particular, Peter and I will be discussing about building this out as a series next year. So if you have any specific questions or topics that you would like us to do. All right, so Justine, may I ask you very quickly to give us your wrap-up thoughts?
Sure, I'll be really quick because I just have to jump at the top of the hour. But I think there's so many great points that were made. You know, this idea that, you know, ESG and corporate social responsibility, I think this generation and, you know, the future is really calling for that to be taken to the next level. I think something that I haven't heard talked about yet today, but maybe is implied is diversity is important. Not, you know, gender diversity, racial diversity. I think, you know, when you're thinking about governance, I just think it's so incredibly important. And, you know, I think even in participation and conversations like this, I look for just, you know, representation of the group. So I think that if that says anything, I think that's one of the most important things when it comes to governance, and will be for the future. And yeah, I think the last point of thinking about the integration of all of the ecosystem that makes up how folks are, you know, particularly family offices and high net worth individuals are, you know, spending their funds. Philanthropy is a big piece of that, but I think, you know, philanthropy as it has been in the past of just sort of giving $5 and it buys 5 pencils is not the kind of philanthropy that anyone wants to engage in. People want to see long-term systemic change. They want to see challenges solved. They want to see, you know, their funds being used as part of the greater ecosystem of their impact investing environment and all the other places they're engaging in. So yeah, I leave you with that. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Justine. I really appreciate that input and particular for us to think about really what are those kinds of projects we want to engage in, not just donation and gift giving, as you say, but if we want to help make a better world, we want to impact something, what are those kinds of projects that we can get started? Because there may be others who are of like mind who would be willing to be part of something like that, rather than just write a check, you know, for something. So thank you so much. Appreciate your being with us today. Misha, can I go to you now to ask for your thoughts, your wrap-up comments for today's sessions?
Thank you, Kamala. Just to say that this has really been a very insightful and very rich conference. But I'll close by saying that any discussion, an ongoing discussion on the great wealth transfer and this new generation that is driving it has to be done within the context of the ESG, and ESG is because it brings a very integrated approach to investment decision, to the management, and to how our companies make the decisions that they make. And I think this whole concept of the environment and social and governance, it's not going to go away. As I end where I started, that the pandemic also has forced us to begin or demand that we take a deeper look on and pull into this when we're looking at the building strategy for companies, to build into that an integrated approach on governance, the pillar of governance. And going back to what you said, Camilla, is ensuring that once these structures are in place, I think it augurs well for how we go forward into the future. What is the future of our work environment and the future of our economies all depend upon all these pillars. I want to thank you again for having me. It was really a pleasure to be here and to participate and to share the platform with Professor Bob Garratt, with you, Justine, and Angela, and Peter. Thank you very much for the stimulating thoughts that have been shared today that have enhanced my own thinking and approach to the discussion and the topic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Misha. Yes, Angela, can we have your closing thoughts as well, please?
And I just said, I think it was really a fantastic day. I mean, there was so much to learn. It's always good to listen from the very learned and experienced people that we've had here in their particular field. As I always say to people, I'm the jack of all trades and master of none. So I listened to all the masters and mistresses today. So very good day indeed, indeed. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. So Professor Garratt, one of the things that Misha just said that reminded me, so she spoke of ESG again, but I know that you have a particular passion for EESG because you think that innovation and creativity must, of course, also be very much at the forefront of our thinking. And I think today that was demonstrated in a great way.
Excellent.
Of thoughts.
May I pick up one point for Justine? You're right about diversity. There was an excellent article that helped me reframe diversity out of the current culture wars at the moment. It was in yesterday's Financial Times by Charlotte Valeur, who has spoken on this screen before, and she was developing the concept of neurodiversity around the boardroom table, and I commend it to you. Then shall I say just a few words?
Sure.
Because I want to focus in the end on you and Peter.
Yeah, this is our wrap up now, Professor Garratt. So you can.
Okay. Right. I haven't got permission to use her name, but someone spoke to us last year when she became slightly unexpectedly chief executive of a major listed company in the UK, a water company. She did a very unexpected thing, and she went on air. It was at the height of the COVID panic, and she simply said to everybody in the whole company, which was many, many thousands of people, I don't know what's going on. You don't know what's going on. None of us know what's going on. So the only stability I can give you as your new chief executive is to say that I promise to guarantee your jobs for the next 2 years, whatever happens. And I have taken out life assurance on all of your lives to 4 times your annual salary for the next 2 years. And I hope that gives you some notion of stability, because I don't know how many of us will be alive or dead at the end of this. However, what I want from you is to have total flexibility in the way you problem solve from now on. I want you all to do as much cooperating, as much problem formulation, but particularly problem resolution as possible. And they, being a water company, it was partly virtual, but mainly it was physical. So, and they had floods, and they had hurricanes, and they had sewage leaks, and they had all sorts of things going on. All I can say is after 2 years, that company is really, really motoring and has done throughout COVID. It's actually, her decisions split, or at least caused great debate, to say the very least, at board level. And some of the institutional investors were horrified by what she'd just done and what she just said, because they were being rewarded on quarterly returns. But 2 years later, that company is really motoring, and she used these action learning processes to get the whole company just to muck in when there was a problem and do whatever was appropriate rather than stick to their job titles. And that's been a very interesting example. So I'm then going to turn it on to Kamla and Peter and say, maybe as a follow-on from today, we should think about creating some action learning groups from here, which people can write to you and suggest what sort of topics really, really interest them. And maybe we could get small groups, mixed groups, neurodiverse groups of, say, 6 people at a time to work on this problem and report back on a regular basis. So action learning. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Garratt. You always throw these wonderful challenges at us in terms of how we do things. So when you did the opening keynote last year for our conference, you said at the end of it, well, you guys are suited, you could now do a global conference.
Yeah.
We were able to do that at the end of the year. And then at the end of the year, you said, but we should have a learning group where we bring people together throughout the year that they could discuss these points and keep growing. And I'm happy we did that for the year as well with our International Learning Network. So now we have in front of us, Peter, I'm including you in this because it's addressed to both of us. We now moved to an action learning group where we actually try to build out a lot of these ideas and document what's happening so that we can grow even more at a faster rate. Certainly something for us to think about and to discuss and see how we can live up to Professor Garratt's expectations.
Okay, thanks for asking me.
Yes. I couldn't agree more, Professor Garratt. And of course, Professor Garratt has sort of had the privilege of being part of what I would call mastermind groups. We would do it actually where I would assemble experts from different areas, but through their integration could strongly help one individual or one body. And they can sometimes, will plan for 2 hours, but they can often go for 4 hours, usually comprising 5 people. And I found when you're focusing on that one or a couple of major issues with those experts that have that diversity of skills, like we've tried to do today on a number of key drivers of the Great Wealth Transfer, that's really where the magic happens. And that's why it's like a action orientated, but it's like a mastermind is created. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, etc. doesn't equal 5. It can mean 555 because you're getting the benefit of those 3 C's again: collaboration, the co-creation, and of course, co-elevating one another. A key component and the engine for it is remember, people over the centuries, of course, whether it's for religion, for survival, for their country, have literally risked their lives and died for a crusade. People are so focused on identity-based politics and all of these other things, even though in some cases you would see how they're raised and what their value system was as a younger person may be very, very different. So, and that's what we have is a unifying force, particularly with philanthropy and impact, and this next generation strongly embody with the statement I made, they want to make a difference. I think the definition is, we need to clarify, is how do we want to make a difference in the world, number one, and putting that at the top as the priority, and then seeing, of course, what is the mutually valuable and beneficial action points with these different peer groups that we form. Like I mentioned, Singapore, if Singapore are forming peer groups, etc., for family offices, then I think that's something that we need to look at. For the Caribbean particularly as well, we need to understand, and Michael Manielli put this very, very eloquently, about how you are, a brand is the Caribbean. So together and unified, you are much stronger. competing against one another in certain areas perhaps could be counterproductive. Now, I understand there's certain areas you will be competing with one another, but I think having that synchronized and integrated approach of what you are going to do together as a group for governance gives you a huge advantage. And like was also discussed in the digital transformation discussion quite specifically, Federico mentioned this, and I was going to elaborate upon it, but there wasn't really time, is the one advantage is you being small and nimble is an advantage. So don't think that just because you don't have the human capital of a New York City or a London, that you're necessarily behind in the times. You can actually create a new system through governance, through technology, or other areas that does not exist, and implement and test it on a small scale before you roll out on a larger one. And the world seems to be playing into your advantage because, with this new remote living and virtual lifestyle, some people will want to physically come to the Caribbean and live there because it's such a beautiful place. Again, we may not have Michael lining up to do it because he doesn't like the climate, but many other people do love the lifestyle there, where they can get that calm, creative, conducive environment, but at the same time still do the hustle and bustle of a New York City, of a Hong Kong, or of a London, whilst simultaneously, as the virtual market grows, you can look at how you can serve more the virtual market where they're not necessarily physically there, but with the USP that you formed. Again, look at Cayman as an example, BVI to a sort of a lesser degree. That's where they've now got that virtual component, at least for certain financial industries, underway. And in closing, I would just look at, of course, the key thing, as I was emphasized, is where the family office, the institutional, and the governments are working towards the same goals. And that's where I think, as a small nation, where you have that one advantage, where even the big parties come in and fly in, like Davos is a perfect example. Around certain initiatives, you can be and create your own Davos, one for the very private individual that doesn't want to be in a crowd and discuss their affairs, and then for the others that do like to say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I do, and integrate that way. And in closing, I think E, as in economic returns, plus entrepreneurship, plus ESG, is something to consider, because in addition to the many models you've seen, the economic returns means it takes a lot of the capital that would be reserved to, say, the private equity, the real estate, the VC and other buckets that are for profit driven, and have them diverted there. So you're augmenting, you're not necessarily stripping assets from one to the other. And that's where I believe that with the GIN number of 715 billion in the long term, we can look at a much, much larger market of social impact investment from that perspective. And on that, I'll just close and say thank you kindly for your tremendous contributions, everyone in attendance, our distinguished panelists and expert international speakers. It's been a great honor from my side, and I look forward to us integrating, harmonizing, and creating that action group, that mastermind, to proliferate a better and sustainable future for us all globally.
Well done, Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I just want to close by saying it was such a pleasure to collaborate with you, for us to work and put together today's session. And I look forward to us doing much more in the new year. So to say a goodbye to everyone, remember we have our global conference coming up 1st and 2nd of December with another very exciting topic, which is the resurrection of entrepreneurship. It's going to be a lot of discussions around ESG and that creativity and innovation, and how do we use it. We will certainly be able to build on some of what was shared today. So thank you all very much. And I appreciate you all taking the time to spend the day with us. And we look forward to you at another session hosted by the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. Have a great evening.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Bye.